1943. Deep beneath the ruins of Stalingrad, one of Hitler's most senior commanders sat in a freezing basement, unshaven, exhausted, and surrounded by the last fragments of a dying army. Hours earlier, Adolf Hitler had promoted him to field marshal, not as an honor, but as a message. No German field marshal had ever been captured alive. He was expected to die. Instead, Friedrich Paulus chose something even more dangerous. He chose to live. By the end of January 1943, the German Sixth Army was no longer an army in any real sense. It was a collapsing mass of starving men trapped inside a city that had already become a graveyard. For weeks, Stalingrad had been closing in around them. Soviet forces had encircled the Germans back in November during Operation Uranus, sealing off more than 200,000 men inside a shrinking pocket of rubble, ice, and death. At first, Berlin insisted they could hold. Hermann Göring promised the Luftwaffe would keep the army alive from the air. Food, fuel, ammunition, medicine, everything would be flown in. On paper, it sounded possible. In reality, it was fantasy. The transport planes never came in the numbers required, and when they did, they often arrived too late, too light, or not at all. Men who had once marched across Europe with confidence were now killing horses for meat, burning furniture for warmth, and waiting for supplies that never landed. Then came Manstein's relief attempt, Operation Winterstorm. For a brief moment in December, hope flickered. German troops pushed toward Stalingrad from the southwest, and some inside the pocket believed rescue was still possible. But that hope died in the snow. The relief force stalled roughly 30 miles short. 30 miles, close enough to imagine salvation, but too far to touch it. And Hitler still refused to authorize a breakout. Inside the city, conditions became almost impossible to describe. The wounded filled cellars and makeshift aid stations, many lying for days without treatment. Frostbite blackened hands and feet. Ammunition ran low. Rations shrank to almost nothing. Soviet artillery pounded the ruins day and night, reducing one position after another into dust. By late January, many soldiers no longer fought for victory or even survival. They fought because there was nothing else left to do. And at the center of this catastrophe sat General Friedrich Paulus. He had been a meticulous staff officer before the war, disciplined, intelligent, obedient, not a flamboyant battlefield gambler like Rommel. Not a political fanatic. Paulus was a planner, a man of procedure, a soldier shaped by structure. But Stalingrad had stripped all structure away. By the final days, his headquarters had been pushed into the basement of the Univermag department store in the city center. Above him, Stalingrad was dying. Around him, his officers waited for orders that could no longer change anything. Then, on 30 January 1943, a radio message arrived from Hitler. Paulus was being promoted to field marshal. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the highest honor of a military career, but nothing about Stalingrad was normal. Everyone in that basement understood what the promotion really meant. Hitler was not rewarding Paulus, he was cornering him. No German or Prussian field marshal had ever surrendered alive. The implication was unmistakable. If Paulus could not win, he was expected to die. It was one of the coldest and cruelest messages Hitler ever sent. Paulus understood it immediately. So did the men around him. But when the suggestion of suicide was raised, he reportedly answered with quiet contempt. He had no intention of doing himself in for that Austrian corporal. In that single decision, Paulus broke with the regime that had shaped his entire war. The next morning, Soviet troops pushed into the department store.
Among the first officers to enter was Major Anatoly Soldatov. What he found was not the image of proud, defiant German command, but exhaustion and ruin. The rooms were filthy, the air was stale. The officers inside looked half-starved and hollow-eyed. These were no longer conquerors, they were survivors of a machine that had finally consumed itself. Paulus surrendered, not with a dramatic speech, not with a final stand, just surrender. Quiet, exhausted, unavoidable surrender. But even then, the battle was not fully over. In the northern sector of the city, another pocket still held out. General Karl Strecker and the remnants of his command continued resisting for 2 more days near the Barakadi factory. Only on 2nd February did the last organized German resistance in Stalingrad finally collapse. The battle that had begun as Hitler's bid to seize the Volga and break Soviet power had ended in one of the greatest military disasters in modern history. And then came the sorting. As Soviet troops moved through the ruins, prisoners were separated with ruthless efficiency. Ordinary soldiers were herded into columns. Officers were pulled aside. Generals and senior commanders were treated differently, not out of kindness, but because they were valuable. These men were no longer simply defeated enemies, they were assets. Paulus, his chief of staff Arthur Schmidt, and a small circle of senior officers were taken away under heavy guard. The rest of the Sixth Army began a very different journey. Roughly 91,000 German soldiers had survived long enough to surrender. That number sounds large until you remember how many had entered the pocket just months earlier. And even for those who laid down their weapons, survival was still far from guaranteed. The march east began almost immediately. Columns of ragged, frost-bitten prisoners stretched for miles across the frozen steppe. Many could barely walk. Some had wrapped their feet in rags because their boots had disintegrated. Others carried comrades who would not make it much further. Hunger had hollowed them out. Disease had already begun moving through the ranks. Soviet guards drove them forward with little patience and even less sympathy. For many of those guards, these were the same men who had invaded their homeland, burned their villages, and brought unimaginable destruction across the Soviet Union. Mercy was in short supply. And the worst part was this: Stalingrad was not the end of their suffering. For most, it was only the beginning.
The first months of captivity were catastrophic. Many of the men captured at Stalingrad were already physically broken before they ever reached a prison camp. They had endured starvation, exposure, untreated wounds, dysentery, typhus, and total collapse of military medical care. Once they were marched out of the city, thousands simply began to disappear. Some died by the roadside and were left where they fell. Others reached overcrowded transit camps only to collapse there, sleeping on frozen ground with almost no shelter, no blankets, and almost no food. Disease moved faster than any army. The Soviet Union, devastated by years of invasion and destruction, had little capacity and even less urgency to care for so many enemy prisoners. To Soviet authorities, the men of the Sixth Army were both a burden and a symbol. They were proof that the German war machine could be broken, but they were also thousands of half-dead mouths to feed in a country that had already suffered beyond imagination. For the ordinary soldiers, captivity became a slow war of attrition. Some were transported to labor camps in Siberia. Others were sent to Central Asia, or the industrial regions of the Urals. There they would spend years cutting timber, hauling materials, digging, building, and surviving under conditions that often differed from death only in pace. Of the roughly 91,000 who surrendered at Stalingrad, only around 6,000 would ever make it back to Germany. That number alone tells you almost everything. But the generals were spared that immediate fate, not because they were forgiven, and not because the Soviets respected them, but because they were useful. By mid-1943,
Many of the captured senior officers had been transferred to a special facility known as Camp Number 48 at Voikovo, near Ivanovo, northeast of Moscow. Compared to the camps holding ordinary prisoners, it was another world. The camp occupied what had once been a sanatorium. It had walls, heating, furniture, proper rooms, and enough food to keep important prisoners alive. Among the Germans, it earned a nickname that sounded almost unreal after Stalingrad, the Castle. But comfort did not mean freedom. Every conversation was watched, every complaint was noted. NKVD officers monitored the prisoners constantly, often using interpreters, attendants, and even fellow inmates to gather information. The Soviets were not simply keeping these men alive, they were studying them, pressuring them, measuring who might bend and who would not. Because Moscow had a larger plan, the Soviet leadership understood that these captured generals had value far beyond the battlefield. They were not just defeated officers, they were symbols. If even men from Hitler's once glorious Wehrmacht could be turned against the Nazi regime, then those men could be weaponized in a different kind of war, a propaganda war. In July 1943, the Soviets launched the National Committee for a Free Germany, known as the NKFD. Officially, it called on Germans to overthrow Hitler and end the war. In practice, it was a propaganda machine designed to fracture German morale from the inside. Broadcasts, pamphlets, leaflets, statements, all of it aimed at convincing German soldiers and civilians that the war was lost and loyalty to Hitler was suicide. Then, in September, came something even more targeted, the League of German Officers. This was no communist front made up only of exiles. This was meant to speak directly to the Wehrmacht, using its own language, its own rank structure, and its own authority. And the most controversial figure attached to it was a man who had already split from Paulus before the battle even ended, General Walther von Seydlitz. Seydlitz was not an obvious revolutionary. He was a career officer, aristocratic, experienced, and deeply embedded in the German military tradition. But during the final days at Stalingrad, he had reached a brutal conclusion earlier than most. The battle was over, and further resistance was meaningless. Without Paulus's approval, he had authorized subordinate officers to surrender if they saw fit. For that act, Paulus stripped him of command. Now, in Soviet captivity, Seydlitz went much further. He openly cooperated.
Under Soviet supervision, he began making radio appeals to German troops, urging them to stop fighting for Hitler. He appeared in propaganda efforts, signed declarations, and attached his name to a campaign aimed at breaking the Wehrmacht's faith in its own leadership. At one point, he even proposed creating an anti-Nazi German force from prisoners of war, an army that could fight alongside the Red Army and perhaps even be inserted into Germany itself to trigger revolt from within. The Soviets never approved that plan. It was too ambitious, too unstable, and probably too dangerous even for them. But the mere existence of the idea sent a shockwave through Nazi Germany. Back in Berlin, the regime treated Seydlitz not as a prisoner, but as a traitor. His name became poison. The phrase Seydlitz troops entered German military vocabulary as a kind of warning, a label for men who had crossed the line from defeat into betrayal. In April 1944, Hitler's government sentenced him to death in absentia. But they did not stop there. His family was targeted too, under the Nazi policy of Sippenhaft, collective punishment imposed on relatives of alleged traitors. In Hitler's Germany, loyalty was not individual, it was hereditary. If one man turned, the entire bloodline could be made to suffer. And while Seydlitz became the face of cooperation, Friedrich Paulus remained stubbornly silent. For more than a year, he refused to participate in Soviet propaganda. He would speak when ordered, he would answer questions,
But he would not cross that final line, not yet. Even after Stalingrad, some part of him still clung to the old military code, not loyalty to Hitler necessarily, but loyalty to Germany as he understood it. He had obeyed all his life. He had built his identity around obedience. To publicly denounce the regime would mean acknowledging not only that Hitler had failed, but that Paulus himself had served a doomed and criminal system to the very end. That is not an easy realization for any man to survive. So he resisted, quietly, cautiously, internally. But history was moving toward him, whether he wanted it to or not. And in the summer of 1944, it finally broke him.
On 20th July 1944, a bomb exploded inside Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. The assassination attempt failed. Hitler survived, and what followed was one of the most savage internal purges in the history of the Third Reich. Thousands were arrested. Officers were dragged before sham courts. Old comrades, aristocrats, staff officers, field commanders, men who had once stood at the center of Germany's military elite were humiliated, tortured, and executed. Some were hanged slowly with piano wire. Others were forced to watch the destruction of everything they had sworn to serve. For Friedrich Paulus, this was the breaking point. He had known some of these men personally. They were not abstract conspirators in a report. They were fellow officers, men of his world, men who had finally concluded, too late, that Hitler was leading Germany into ruin. When Field Marshal Walther von Seydlitz and others were executed after the failed plot, something in Paulus finally collapsed. On 8 August 1944, he did what Hitler would once have considered unthinkable. He spoke publicly against the regime. Broadcasting on Free Germany radio, Paulus addressed German soldiers directly. His message was blunt, devastating, and impossible to dismiss. Germany, he said, had already lost the war. The only path left was to abandon Hitler. Coming from a captured field marshal, the very man who had commanded the 6th Army at Stalingrad, it was a political weapon of enormous value for the Soviets and a personal act of irreversible betrayal in the eyes of the Nazi state. The response from Berlin was immediate. His wife, Elena, and his daughter were placed under Sippenhaft. His family became hostages to his decision. That is one of the ugliest truths about this story. Even when these men were thousands of miles from Germany, trapped behind Soviet lines, the regime still had ways to reach into their lives and punish them. No prison wall was thick enough to stop that. Then, after the war, Paulus's role changed again. In February 1946, he was brought to Nuremberg. The courtroom was packed with some of the most powerful surviving figures of the Nazi state. Men who had once issued orders to continents now sat in the dock, waiting to be judged. For months, defense lawyers had tried to dismiss earlier Soviet-submitted statements from Paulus as fabricated or coerced. They assumed the Soviets would never risk producing him in person. They were wrong. When the tribunal asked how long it would take to bring the witness to court, the Soviet prosecutor calmly answered, about 30 minutes. Paulus was already nearby. The Soviets had moved him through occupied Germany in secrecy, reportedly using decoys to reduce the chance of assassination, and when he finally appeared in the courtroom, it caused a sensation. Here was the former commander of the 6th Army, alive, composed, and prepared to speak against the very leadership he had once served. His testimony mattered. Paulus confirmed that planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union had begun well before June 1941, while he had been serving in the general staff.
He described the military preparations in detail and directly implicated senior figures such as Wilhelm Keitel and Alfred Jodl in the planning and execution of Operation Barbarossa. These were not rumors, these were statements from a man who had been inside the machine. And for the defendants sitting across from him, it was devastating. Some had once seen Paulus as a model officer, disciplined, reliable, loyal. Now he was helping to convict them. After Nuremberg, Paulus did not go home. He returned to the Soviet Union and remained in captivity, though under much better conditions than before. He was housed in a guarded villa near Moscow, given improved food, and allowed limited movement. It was not freedom, but it was no longer the brutal uncertainty that had swallowed most of his army. Other Stalingrad generals followed very different paths. Arthur Schmidt, Paulus's hard-line chief of staff, never bent. He refused every Soviet attempt to recruit him into anti-Nazi propaganda. Even when offered better conditions, he held to his oath and reportedly chose prison over cooperation. He remained in Soviet captivity for 12 years and was only released in 1955. Generaloberst Walter Heitz, by contrast, never lived long enough to face those choices. He had demanded that his men fight to the last bullet at Stalingrad, but he died in Soviet captivity in February 1944, just 1 year after his surrender. Others adapted.
Some of the officers who cooperated with Soviet programs went on to play roles in the creation of East Germany. Otto Korfus, once a divisional commander at Stalingrad, later worked inside the East German state and eventually rose to senior rank in its armed police structure. Arno von Lenski followed a similar road, helping to build East Germany's armored forces. Men who had once fought for Hitler now helped construct a Soviet-aligned German state. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Stalingrad itself, because these generals did not simply survive a battle. They became pieces in the political rearrangement of Europe. Their lives after captivity were shaped by a new divide, the Cold War. In East Germany, cooperation with the Soviets could be reframed as anti-fascist realism. In West Germany, the same actions could mark a man forever as dishonored. Some returned as patriots in one system and traitors in the other. Then came the long-delayed homecoming. In 1953, Friedrich Paulus was finally released and allowed to settle in Dresden in East Germany. He took a quiet civilian role connected to military history and largely stayed out of the spotlight. But by then, the private cost of survival had become impossible to ignore. His wife, Elena, had died in West Germany in 1949. He never saw her again. His son, Friedrich, had been killed in action in Italy in 1944. When Paulus returned to German soil, the family he had left behind was already gone. Walther von Seydlitz's fate was even more bitterly ironic. Despite years of cooperation with the Soviets, he was later sentenced to death by a Soviet military tribunal in 1950 for alleged war crimes committed during his earlier service in the Wehrmacht. The sentence was commuted almost immediately to 25 years in prison. Even after serving the Soviet cause, he was still expendable. Only in 1955, after West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated with Moscow, did Seydlitz and thousands of other remaining prisoners finally come home. That moment became known as the Return of the 10,000. In October 1955, former prisoners began arriving back in West Germany. At transit camps like Friedland, families stood in crowds searching the faces of men they had not seen in more than a decade. Many of those faces were almost unrecognizable, hollow, aged, exhausted. Sons had become middle-aged men. Wives had become widows in but paperwork.
Children were now adults, greeting fathers they barely remembered. It was a homecoming, but not a restoration. Seydlitz returned to a country that wanted little to do with him. Former comrades viewed him as a traitor. The new West German military denied him honors. Although his Nazi-era death sentence was eventually overturned, the stain never truly faded. He spent the rest of his life in near obscurity and died in Bremen in 1976. Decades later, in 1996, Russia posthumously pardoned him. Paulus died earlier in Dresden on 1st February 1957, exactly 14 years after his surrender. His body was taken west and buried beside his wife in Baden-Baden. And then, slowly, the generation of Stalingrad began to disappear. One by one, the surviving generals died off, carrying with them memories of a battle that had not only destroyed an army, but exposed the limits of loyalty itself. The last of them, Karl Rodenberg, survived until 1992. But the final truth of this story does not belong to the generals. It belongs to the men who followed them. Roughly 91,000 German soldiers surrendered at Stalingrad. Only around 6,000 ever came home. The generals, for all their suffering, were separated, preserved, studied, and sometimes repurposed. They became witnesses, collaborators, prisoners of ideology, survivors of a war that kept claiming pieces of them long after the shooting stopped. Their soldiers would not given that chance. They vanished into marches, camps, disease, hunger, labor, and snow. So when we ask what happened to the German generals captured at Stalingrad, the answer is not just that some survived and some did not. It is that they walked out of history's most infamous battlefield and into a second ordeal, one shaped not by artillery and encirclement, but by propaganda, politics, memory, and guilt. They escaped the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, but almost none of them escaped what Stalingrad meant.